Hello everyone, this video will focus on the poem London from the Power and Conflict Poetry cluster, which is part of English Literature, paper 2. Just with the previous videos, I'm not going to be reading the poem in this video. You should have read or at least listened to this poem at least twice. I've picked out already the key words and phrases that we are going to zoom in on and explore. Remember, you cannot remember everything about these 15 poems, so you just need to remember some key quotations that you could write about if you were writing about this poem in relation to the named poem in the exam. Let's have a look at the poem London then and see what it's about overall, and then we'll focus a bit on the context in terms of William Blake, who was the poet. So just like we're checking out my history, we've got a first person perspective here. Now the likelihood is that this voice in the poem is Blake's voice, it's his perspective, because what he's saying matches up a lot with what we know about his own beliefs. What's the poem actually about? Its literal meaning. Well, in the poem, this speaker, possibly Blake, walks through the streets of London and he comments on the sadness and the corruption that he sees. It's also important to understand the sort of metaphorical or the wider meaning. What is going on here? Well, as he walks through the streets of London and comments on the sadness, it is an opportunity or a way for him to criticise the authorities, the establishment, the government, and also the church, for the lack of treatment, or its lack of care and bad treatment or poor treatment of its people. That really gives us a sense of the overall meaning. Now, William Blake was writing over 200 years ago during the Industrial Revolution in the UK. So think about what you know from A Christmas Carol, because you know a lot about the Industrial Revolution already. It was a time when there was a great suffering for the poor and they were oppressed, and there was a lack of government support. So there was no welfare. But there was also a lack of support from the church. We see that in A Christmas Carol, where there's an expectation that rich individuals support the poor because nobody else is going to step up and do that. Now also during this time there was a revolution going on in France. And Blake was really inspired by this revolution because during the French Revolution, the French citizens fought against the establishment of their country, and they uprooted the monarchy. They managed to get rid of the monarchy and they fought against it. So for Blake, the revolution was a symbol of how the common man, just your average person, could seize power and actually really, if they put their mind to it, had the power to change things, just like had happened in France. And that's partly because Blake was anti-monarchy. He was against the royal family. He didn't think we should have one. So he wanted this revolution in the UK because he felt that London, which again was a really influential, powerful city, not just in the UK, but across the world, and he felt that London had been corrupted by greed and by inequality. Now we can see how Blake's own beliefs about greed and inequality match up with Charles Dickens's beliefs that are typified, personified in the character of Scrooge in A Christmas Carol. So we do have a real sense of the upper classes during this time being very wealthy, and the way that they treated the poor, this real strong divide between the rich and the poor, that obviously a lot of people felt very strongly about, such as Dickens and Blake, which encouraged them to write about it. Let's start to get into the detail then of the poem. So it's really important that you've highlighted the same quotations as me. We'll have a look at verse 1 first in the title. So in this verse, and you don't need to write this bit down in the box here, we see Blake walking through the streets of London along the River Thames, and he sees signs of the suffering and sadness in every person that he passes. So again, it's assumed that you will understand what the poem is about because the examiner is expecting you to have studied it, which you have. So let's just think about the title first. London was arguably at the time the most powerful city in the world during the Industrial Revolution. But actually what we see in the suffering of the people in verse 1 juxtaposes this idea of power. The people here don't seem powerful at all. So firstly, we see that Blake is wandering through the streets. And we've got lots of words that relate to either freedom or its opposite, control. The fact that Blake is able to wander suggests freedom in this verb. And he seems to behave differently, the speaker, to the people around him. And that might symbolise Blake's views, the fact that his views were different to a lot of the other people that were around him during that time. And he walks along chartered streets near where the chartered Thames does flow. So it's important that we understand what chartered means here, because it's been deliberately repeated. When something is chartered, it means it's mapped out, but it can also mean that it's privatised. And so here we can see that areas of land, streets, the river are being privatised. The government were giving rights away to these different parts of land to wealthy people. And these are things that had previously not been owned by anyone. Nobody owned the River Thames. But now suddenly it was a real thoroughfare, ships coming in, carrying things out as part of the Industrial Revolution. And he felt that these things that were previously free were starting to be controlled. They were starting to be chartered. Now this is ironic, really, that the thing that he chooses to focus in on is the Thames. And it says, near where the chartered Thames does flow. If something flows, it's moving freely, just like Blake, who was wandering. So in the same way that Agard talks about, how he felt like his perspective on history was controlled, here we see the government and the establishment again trying to assert authority and control over things that cannot be controlled, such as a river, because it is natural and it is a symbol of nature. He also then repeats the word mark 3 times in this verse. He marks in every face he meets, so as in like remarks or notices, marks of weakness, marks of woe. So he's got visual reminders here, visual signs of suffering on people's faces. Now what we notice in line 4 here is we've got 7 beats or 7 syllables, marks of weakness, marks of woe. Every other line in the verse and the rest of the poem has 8 syllables or 8 beats. So in line 4, we see a real break in this pattern in terms of the rhythm, because it doesn't have as many beats as the other lines. So this break in the rhythm could mimic Blake's belief in a revolution. He believed that people had the opportunity to change. He believed that people could break free from the strict restrictions placed on them by the government. But we can also alternatively interpret this line in a different way, and that's going to help us get our grade 6s or above. So we can say, perhaps it means this, maybe it means that. We don't know, we can't go back in time and ask Blake. So the other alternative interpretation here is that this line is weaker than the others because it's only got 7 beats, or syllables, whereas all the others have got 8 syllables. And so this line being weaker could symbolise the weakness of London's people due to the suffering and oppression they'd endured. So the other argument here is that maybe they weren't strong enough to stand up and fight against the establishment. So the 2 things that we are describing here, the 2 effects, are completely different. One is about saying people are empowered, breaking free from the restrictions, same way that the last line doesn't follow the rhyme scheme, or it could mean that the last line is weak. And again, if you can do this kind of alternative interpretation, it's really going to help you get into some of those higher grades. If you didn't get all of the bits down for verse 1, just make sure you pause it and get all that down before you move on to verse 2. So verse 2 shifts from what Blake can see to what he can hear. So as well as seeing signs of suffering and sadness, he now hears signs of suffering and sadness all around him too. We know when we're talking about hearing, we're talking about auditory imagery. And we can see that in these words here, like voice and cry and sigh and curse, all the way through the poem. We've got this repetition of unpleasant sounds, or sounds that are hard to ignore. And these sounds all the way through symbolise or are signs of people's suffering and unhappiness. Other ideas that it might be worth looking at in this verse are the fact that he hears the cry of every man and the cry of every infant. So we've got a contrast here between man and infant, suggesting that the suffering is universal. No one is spared. No one escapes the suffering, young and old. And we also see the repetition of this word every here, every man, every infant, every voice. And so this conveys the idea that really no one can escape this suffering. Everyone is affected. But the key quotation in this second verse is mind-forged manacles. Mind-forged manacles. Manacles are handcuffs. And if they are mind-forged, these are handcuffs of the mind. These are symbolic handcuffs. And again, this reminds us of A Christmas Carol, this idea of Marley's chains. People have put themselves in chains here. These handcuffs, these manacles are forged in the mind. So there's almost a bit of blame towards the people as well as towards the government, saying, look, you do have the strength to fight back, but you've placed these restrictions on yourself. They're all in your mind. And so he's reminding them that these chains are in the mind, that people are physically free to make their own decisions and have the power to stand up for themselves. And this is the idea of a revolution that maybe this poem is trying to incite and encourage. But again, within this phrase, mind-forged manacles, the other word that's really interesting is the word forged. If you forge something, then you make it yourself. So here he's suggesting that, again, people have allowed themselves to be oppressed. And there's a sense of anger here which definitely mimics checking out my history. Moving on to verse 3. Again, let's just look at the literal meaning first. Blake starts to notice this sense of corruption and deceit, which another word for that is dishonesty of the monarchy. So that's the royal family. And also the corruption of the church and how society, child labourers such as the chimney sweep and the soldiers are affected by this corruption and deceit on a much higher level. So firstly, the chimney sweeper is crying and the blackening church appalls. Again, there's two interpretations that we can work towards here. Blackening could mean the pollution from the Industrial Revolution and that the church buildings are literally getting covered in soot and dirt. But also we want to explore the metaphorical meaning here. So this idea of something being metaphorically dirty suggests this idea of corruption. Blake very much felt that the church didn't do anything to solve the problems of Victorian society. So problems such as poverty, such as child labour. He didn't believe that the church really did anything about that. Now the church should represent something good, but here the church is blackening, which implies evil. So we've got a bit of an oxymoron here when we look at the words blackening and church together, because one has connotations of purity and innocence, and the other one has connotations of evil. Now Blake was a Christian and he really supported Christian values, but he did believe that the institution or the organisation of the church was not fulfilling its duties to the poor, and that really it was charities and individuals that were the only people supporting the poor. He felt that the church could have done more. The other phrase that's really important in this verse is runs in blood down palace walls. Now there is not literally blood running down the palace walls, and here we can see some similarities with Macbeth. It's a metaphor for guilt here. They have got the soldiers' blood on their hands, or the soldiers' blood on their walls, because they, the palace, and therefore the monarchy, are being blamed for the death of innocent people. And again, this is a reminder of the kind of the revolution that was happening in France. And because of this, maybe the monarchy and the government, they were scared of the threat of a revolution. And so they were all about protecting themselves and using the army against the people rather than doing what was right for the people. Make sure you pause this video if you haven't highlighted and got all the notes down on those 2 quotations. Then we move on to the final verse, verse 4. And in this verse, Blake is actually commenting on prostitutes and newborn babies. And then in the final couple of lines, or last line, says he views the carriages of newlyweds as hearses, funeral vehicles. And here we really get a sense of the negativity and the cycle of misery that Blake is trying to describe. So in this verse we have a youthful harlot. And again we can see this oxymoron coming in here. We've got the idea of youth and innocence and purity, just like with the church, being contrasted with something much more adult, the idea of a prostitute. So a youthful harlot, we can write about it as in juxtaposition, but you could also call it an oxymoron. And we can see then how this corruption in society is now corrupting individuals. He's trying to suggest that women have no choice but to turn to immorality and prostitution. And this is a really important image here because he was a real champion, Blake, for women's rights, and we'll see that image kind of come back in a different way later. And so then the prostitute who is swearing is sort of damaging the newborn infant's ear, blast the newborn infant's tear. So the baby is crying, but the sound is loud as well and deafening. It's blasting the newborn infant. And there's deliberate repeated images of children and babies here to symbolise innocence. And this is creating sympathy in the reader because this infant is a complete victim of its circumstance in verse 4. And so then finally we get the phrase, and blights with plague the marriage hearse. We've got words like blights and plague. So again we could write about the semantic field here. If something is blighted, it means it's marked or scarred or diseased. And a plague obviously was a disease that spread throughout society. So what's being implied here is sort of metaphorically that society is diseased. Blight also links back to Mark in the first verse. So he marked in every face he met marks of weakness, marks of woe, and now things are being blighted. So they're leaving a permanent damaged mark. And this link back to the beginning reminds us of this relentless cycle of suffering that Blake could see all around him. And then we get to this unusual phrase, marriage hearse. We've got a real, again, oxymoron here, or juxtaposition of 2 ideas. Marriage should be a time of joy and happiness, and death not so much, symbolised by the word hearse. And this is a metaphor for his own sort of criticism of society. So Blake was a real forerunner in terms of women's rights, and he believed that marriage was like a death for women. They had no rights. They went from being owned by their father to owned by their husband. And so really what he's saying here is, marriage was like a death sentence, because women were so badly treated. So we can see how this phrase, marriage hearse, alongside youthful harlot, work as oxymorons, because the 2 words have very different contrasting meanings. Pause the video here whilst you make sure you have got all those notes down. Let's consider the structure overall then. So we've got some key quotes that will allow us to write about language. On the surface, on the page, the structure seems very simple in this poem. You've got 4 verses, each with 4 lines. That's called quatrains, as in quad. And you've got a verse with 4 lines in. And it follows an A-B rhyme scheme. So we can see in the first verse, street and meet rhyme, and flow and woe rhyme, and so on and so on. So what can we say about this very deceptively simple structure? Well, maybe the simple structure actually contrasts or juxtaposes the complex issues that Blake is raising. We might also want to write about this tight rhyme scheme of A-B, and how the structure mirrors or reflects the control or the power of the authorities over its people. So here the structure kind of represents the authorities and their imposing structures that they've put in place. And and the kind of content of the poem, the different people that are mentioned, the man, the child, the infant, the chimney sweep, the soldier, and so on and so on. They're the people, that's the content of the poem. If you like writing about structure, or you want to really try and get a really high grade, there's a couple of other things that you might want to write about here. Now, the rhyme scheme follows something called iambic tetrameter. This means that there should be, obviously apart from that last line on the first verse, 8 syllables per line. And the pairs of sounds go da-da, 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 da-da. Okay, so the first syllable is not as strong as the second, as in, and mark in every face I meet. Yeah, so we can see that this iambic tetrameter rhyme scheme helps to emphasize the most important words. There's no point writing about iambic tetrameter unless you can write about the effect. So we can say that the rhyme scheme here, within each line, creates a sense of control and order. And this reflects the relentless oppression that was enforced upon these people, just like the rhyme scheme is forced upon the words. Overall, we might want to write about the tone of the poem being very negative or pessimistic. So really just another word for always noticing the bad things in life. And we can glean from this that Blake feels quite disillusioned. It sort of means let down by the government. He feels disillusioned with the monarchy and disillusioned with the church. So despite the fact that he was a believer, he didn't like the kind of established way that they behaved. And this negative, pessimistic and disillusioned tone really comes across in the structure. So what was Blake trying to achieve then? It's important that we weave these ideas into our response. Maybe he was trying to instigate, that means to prompt change. He used deliberately simple language, certainly for people 200 years ago, they would understand some of the references that we don't understand, so that his poetry was accessible and therefore the message of his poems. So he really wanted to encourage people to, reflect on maybe the way they were behaving and see that there was another way to act and to get change through a revolution. He wanted to highlight the inequality in society, especially women's rights. Now, Blake taught his wife to read and to write, and that was really considered quite radical at the time. So again, in terms of these references to the harlot's curse and the marriage hearse, he's really trying to highlight the inequality that women were subjected to. He wants to expose the corruption of the monarchy and the church and the fact that he felt that they abused or misused their power and influence. He wants to criticise that government and the political situation that he was in and reveal the divide between the rich and the poor. He also wanted to empower people as well as instigating change, to give them the power and realise that they did have the freedom to rebel, that their manacles were mind forged, they weren't really locked up, they weren't prisoners. So there's a few key ideas that you might want to write about in terms of writers' ideas for the poem London. Let's have a quick look at themes and links. Clear to see that this is a poem about power and powerlessness and oppression. And again, the other side of that, the idea of the freedom that he has because he's wandering, but the control that is imposed upon him. We've definitely got a conflict here, again, not an internal conflict, but an external conflict between society, or the majority of society, and the establishment. And you could even write about this poem in terms of identity, the experience of the individual within society, the man, the woman, the child, all those different perspectives. Or you could even write about it just in relation to the strong emotions that are explored, such as anger and suffering. So you could compare this with Checking Out My History, you could compare it with Emigre, you could compare it with Kamikaze, as well as plenty of other poems. But there's certainly some real key points there in terms of comparison. Make sure again that you pause the video if you haven't got all of this down and you need a bit more time. On this slide you've got some key prompts, so you can try memorising them, or you can try displaying them and writing about each of the prompts that are listed. Another thing that you can do in terms of revision is revise these key quotations for the poem London. And then finally, there's some questions there for you to answer as part of your revision to make sure that not only have you annotated your copy of the poem, but that you are really thinking about what you're writing in the notes that you're making and committing them to memory. And then the very final slide, when you've done all of that, again, there's a list there of some other ways to revise. I hope you found this video on London helpful.